weather has turned from fall to winter, I'm craving a hearty and warm soup to beat the seasonal chills. In today's episode, we'll be preparing a simple soup recipe with connections to an interesting social custom in Upper Canada in the 1850s. Welcome to the Backwoods Kitchen. I'm your host, Holly Venison, and on today's episode, I'll be preparing a venison soup from the Female Emigrant's Guide.
Venison, otherwise known as deer, was a common food source in Canada for centuries and was recommended to settlers as a meat option due to its accessibility. In Europe, on the other hand, deer were typically reserved for the elite, royalty and aristocracy who had the right to hunt on their own estate properties. As we've seen throughout the series, the Canadian experience was shaped due to its differences from Europe and the ways in which new inhabitants had to adapt to these conditions. I can only imagine the feeling of a new immigrant family creating a meal with venison as the featured ingredient, possibly for the first time in their lives, as this food source was no longer restricted by class. How does someone procure venison anyhow? According to Trail, one way was through what she might call hospitality, but what her Indigenous neighbors might call reciprocity. In one story of hers, a group of hunters on their way home stopped by her cabin. Leaving their weapons outside, they made her kitchen floor comfy for the night and slept in the warmth of the indoors. In exchange, they left for her some of their freshly caught game. Before getting into that story, let's put the soup on. I won't be making any changes to the recipe provided. It is very straightforward, and modifications depending on your ingredient availability and taste is very easy. I feel like carrot, corn, or squash would go nicely with these flavors. As I've discussed throughout the series so far, Indigenous ways of life and settler experiences mingled all the time, so much so that distinct Indigenous practices, foods, and recipes have been appropriated into the general descriptor of Canadian, hence my motivation to explore how foodways were interconnected yet distinct. The anecdote above was a very real practice in Trail's neighborhood, and I would infer in other rural communities as well. It was in line with Indigenous practices of reciprocity, a concept that was often lost on settlers, but had, and still is, a long-standing way of life. To describe this phenomenon, Trail states in the introduction of the guide, "It was no uncommon occurrence for a party of hunters to enter the house. They never knock on any man's door. Leaving their hunting weapons outside, spread their blankets on the floor, and pass the night with or without leave, arise by the first dawn of day, gather their garments about them, resume their weapons, and silently and noiselessly depart. Sometimes a leash of wild ducks hung on the door latch, or a haunch of venison left in the kitchen, would be found as a token of gratitude for the warmth and shelter afforded them. Many strangers, both male and female, have found shelter under our roof, and never were we led to regret that we had not turned the houseless wanderer from our door," indicating to us the responsibilities of reciprocity were taken seriously by the hunters. This practice varies from nation to nation, but heavily hinges on practices of sharing and community. Trail's sister Susanna Moody also had a similar experience when ducks were left on her doorstep by an Anishinaabe friend, John Nogan. He left them without being noticed because Susanna and her family were not in a position to reciprocate. They were experiencing hardship and hunger and had nothing to offer in return. For Europeans, the general practice was to provide for the self and the immediate family, whereas in Indigenous worldview provided for the community as a whole, making these acts, from a settler point of view, of charity seem unusual, even though it is a pillar of Indigenous worldview. Outside of individual experiences, government bodies also failed to understand concepts of reciprocity during treaty negotiations, whose acceptance rested on assumptions of reciprocity that were not consistent with the treaty terms, leading to loss of land and hunting and fishing territories, as succinctly stated by historians Fiona Lucas and Natalie Cook. By the time the Female Emigrant's Guide was published, the Anishinaabe were locked into multiple treaties, with the understanding that the settlers would uphold concepts of reciprocity discussed during negotiations, even though most individual settlers were likely unaware of their treaty obligations, a tradition which has continued throughout Canadian history.
I find it so interesting that one ingredient can connect to so many different histories. So I hope your cup of soup has taught you something new today, and that you'll join me by the fire for a taste test. So it doesn't look super appetizing, I'm not gonna lie. It really did lose its color, but it smells amazing. That is excellent. I definitely think I could have added more seasoning. I think I will in the future, but the venison adds like this really gamey flavor to it. It's just infused with everything. And the wild rice is not, once again, something that a lot of people typically have nowadays. It's got a lot of health benefits too, wild rice. But this is exactly what I was craving, just a nice, wintry, hearty soup. So add that to your list of historical recipes to make. Once again, thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. And cheers, until next time.